evening, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Book Passages Conversations with Authors. I'm your host, Paula Farmer. For those of you live or later in the recording who have been patiently waiting for the reschedule of this event, which was supposed to happen last week and we rescheduled for tonight, your wait is over. And I know you're just as excited as I am. I'm so happy to be hosting these two immensely talented writers with timely messages of immigration, war, family, and identity, and doing so with their own very special brand of creativity. Before we get into the formal introductions of both of them and into the event, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It takes you like 2 seconds, but for us at Book Passage, it really helps us keep up with these type of great events. So like and subscribe. Also keep in mind, we do have a live chat going. So as you're hearing the discussion, feel free to put in your questions or comments, and both our authors will get to them later in the event. One of our two featured books, and that's right, we're having two featured books tonight, but one of them is American Fever, a debut novel by Aziz Amna. And it's about a protagonist who's on a year-long exchange program in rural Oregon, a Pakistani student, 16-year-old Hira. She must swap Kashmir chai for volleyball practice and try to understand why everybody around her seems to dislike Obama. An utterly enjoyable protagonist. She finds herself stuck between worlds. American Fever is about compelling and laugh out loud funny novel, and it's also about adolescence, family, otherness, and religion. Dur-E grew up in Pakistan and now lives in my home state, I forgot to tell you this, of Michigan. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Financial Times, and Long Reads, among many other publications. She's won the 2019 Financial Times Prize and was longlisted for the Sunday Times Audible Short Story Award in 2020. Our other featured guest, Jamil Kochai, also has a newly released book, The Haunting of Haji Hotak and Other Stories. Nope, that's on this side of me. I'm flanked by both their books. This is a wonderfully gripping collection, moving exploration of characters grappling with the ghosts of war and displacement, and one that speaks to the immediate political landscape we reckon with today. Jamil is the author of 99 Nights in Logar, which was a finalist for the PEN/Hemingway Award for debut novel and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. He was born in an Afghan refugee camp in Pakistan, but originally hails from Afghanistan. His short stories and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, and many more. Currently, he is exploring, cultivating the Stegner Fellow at Stanford University, right in the backyard of Book Passage. With that, I'm going to turn it over to both their very capable hands. We look forward to this introduction and exploration.
Hey, thank you so much, Paula. So I think we'll kick things off. If Dore doesn't mind, with a couple of readings. So I'll read first, and then Dore will read from her brilliant novel, American Fever, and then we'll get this conversation going, inshallah.
Great.
Okay, so I'm just going to read a couple of pages here from my short story, Playing Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, which is it's the first story in my collection. First, you have to gather the cash to pre-order the game at the local GameStop where your cousin works. And even though he hooks it up with the employee discount, the game is still a bit out of your price range because you've been using your Taco Bell paychecks to help your pops, who's been out of work since you were 10, and who makes you feel unbearably guilty about spending money on useless hobbies, while kids in Kabul are destroying their bodies to build compounds for white businessmen and warlords. But shit, it's Kojima, it's Metal Gear. So, after scrimping and saving, like literal dimes you're picking up off the street, you've got the cash, which you give to your cousin, who purchases the game on your behalf, and then, on the day it's released, you just have to find a way to get to the store. But because your oldest brother has taken the Civic to Sac State, you're hauling your 260-pound ass on a bicycle you haven't touched since middle school, regretting all the Taco Bell you've eaten over the past 2 years. But thank Allah, if he's up there, you ride with such fervor that you end up second in line. And it's your cousin himself who hands you the game in a brown paper bag as if it were something illegal or illicit, which it isn't, of course. It's Metal Gear, it's Kojima, it's the final game in a series so fundamentally a part of your childhood that often when you hear the Irish Gaelic chorus from The Best Is Yet to Come, you cannot help weeping softly into your keyboard. For some reason, writing back home is easier. You leave the bike behind the trash cans at the side of your father's house and hop the wooden fence into the backyard. And if the garage door is locked, which it is, you've got to take a chance on the screen door in the backyard. But lo and behold, your father is ankle deep in the dirt, hunched over, yanking at weeds with his bare hands the way he used to as a farmer in Logad, before war and famine forced him to flee to the western coast of the American Empire, where he labored for many years until it broke his body for good. And even though his doctor has forbidden him to work in the yard, owing to the torn nerves in his neck and spine, which you know from your mother were first damaged when he was tortured by Russians shortly after the murder of his younger brother, Watuk, during the Soviet War. He is out here clawing at the earth and its spoils as if he were digging for treasure or his own grave. Spotting you only 4 feet away from the sliding glass door, he gestures for you to come over, and though you are tired and sweaty, with your feet aching, and the most important game of the decade hidden inside your underwear, you approach him. He signals for you to crouch down beside him. Then he runs his dirty fingers through his hair until flakes of his scalp fall onto his shoulders and his beard. This isn't good. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamil. And I want to start off by just saying it's truly such an honor to be here with you. Thank you so much, Paula, for hosting this event and Book Passage. And it's I read 99 Nights in Logar, which is Jamil's first novel, obviously, the year it came out, and there's so many things that are stunning about it that I will inevitably end up bringing into this conversation as well, even though it's going to be primarily about the haunting of Haji Hotak. And it's truly such an honor to be here with you. And I will also start off by doing a very short reading from the novel. And because with novels mostly, it's best to just do the very beginning and not too much of it. I'll just read the first couple of pages of American Fever. January. By God, I had planned to keep it to myself and God. But then the sheets speckled red. Blood, like pomegranate jewels, spots the pillowcase. It's the night of Kelly's wedding. The Pacific Northwest has received a flurry of snow, and as I get out of bed to gargle away the metal from my mouth, I wonder how the drops of red will look on the pristine white of the patio. I wonder if the blood means the disease is now severe, even lethal. Mostly, I wonder how much of this is America's doing. In the morning, I go out to the living room where Kelly and Ethan are nursing their coffees, clearly hungover. I tell Kelly she has to take me to the doctor. She still has mascara on from last night. Can this wait, Hira? I shake my head, tell her it must be today, and my host mother's face sets into annoyance, which is doubly unfortunate because she and I shared a tender moment last night, the kind of thing that has become a rarity of late. This must not be how she and Ethan plan to spend the first morning of their marriage, but I can't drive and she is the adult in charge, so this is how it has to be. In the car ride to the doctor's, I tried to make conversation, telling her I had a great time attending my first American wedding. Kelly loves it when I posit myself as a virgin to America, so that cheers her up a bit. I also mentioned that I spoke with Ali on the phone after the party. So are you two dating now? He lives in New York. I'm going back to Pakistan in 5 months. Yes, but life is long, she says, and you're smart. I'll be shocked if you don't find your way back to America. You're assuming I want to. See, that's my problem. Kelly's doing me a favor by driving me around the day after her wedding. Why can't I keep my mouth shut? Well, she says, frowning, they do say it's the land of opportunity. Kelly lives in rural Oregon, where the state of opportunity is such that I haven't been able to find an after-school job in 5 months. But it's 2011, America is still king of the world, the cool guys in the White House, and Kelly can't comprehend the rest of the world not clamoring for these shores. I just hope you see your own potential, she continues. If you remain in Pakistan, I'll always worry about your safety. Again, it's 2011, and Americans are worried about everyone else's safety, sated in the knowledge that their nook of the world is far safer than elsewhere, although don't tell them why that might be. History is what happens in other places. America transcends it. This will all change, but at the time, I can merely nod. Leaving home isn't easy, I say, offering my own banality in response to hers. And you've already done it at such a young age, she replies, upbeat, as we take the Eugene exit. Mark my words, you'll be back in no time. My mother tells me that the first time she returned to Hamburg, she cried every morning for California. Did you ever ask her how many times she's cried for Hamburg? Kelly sighs. I am so bloody difficult. She's much happier here. I pinch back my tongue and change the subject to the honeymoon. Kelly and Ethan are leaving for Hawaii next week. But I don't buy it, that thing she says about her mother. Of course, one can be happy anywhere. Certain zip codes help, and yet none are necessary. But it is Kelly's certainty that irks me. Her mother must have done what many immigrants do. Create neat narratives for their children, flimsy accounts of one-way movement they then begin to internalize. A lie told often enough becomes the truth. And perhaps these accounts are not lies, but simply omissions that delight over how home is forever that other place. The first one to drive you to despair. The lover you took before learning to externalize the deeds of the world. It is the sole landscape of dreams, the only place that will ever convince you that its failings, its bounties, its excesses and caresses are all your own. After all, where does it end and you begin? Okay, and I will end there.
Okay, so I was hoping we could, start off our conversation by talking a little bit about Hira herself, our narrator. You have this beautiful opening paragraph. By God, I had planned to keep it to myself and God, but then the sheets speckle red, blood like pomegranate jewels spots the pillowcase, right? And so it's this introduction immediately to this vibrant poetic voice. I loved her character overall. Such a I think such a brilliant narrator for our novel, such a great a great guide as well. She was so biting and smart and flawed, but also incredibly resistant to cliche as well. So could you talk a little bit about how you developed her character and her narrative voice in particular, which yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So one of the interesting things that happened during the sort of writing and editing and redrafting stages of the novel is that I started off with Hira being so initially in one of the very first drafts, which was awful, by the way, as most first drafts are. The story was very much told from Hira's perspective as it happens. So from the 16-year-old's perspective. And so for now, for those people who haven't read the book, it is told from this like from this older hero's perspective. She's
Right.
never really situated.
Yeah.
So you never really get to know where she is now, how old she is, what stage of life she's at now. We just know that she's someone with more perspective than
Hmm.
and I had to go back and forth in that because on the one hand I didn't want there to be too much I think sometimes it can get a little like almost too hands of gaudy when you have someone older who's like, oh, and I went into the grocery store and I thought about this, and then it led me to having the entire, sort of like
Yeah.
glimpse into my past and what, and I didn't really want to
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
that. But I also thought that it's very, very hard to pull off, and you do in a couple of your stories, but it's very hard to pull off a very young character without any perspective, because
Hmm.
young characters, they can be so smart, but they can also just be so
That's
stupid,
right. Yeah, no,
obviously.
totally agree. Yeah.
And so I wanted to have that perspective, that later perspective. And so after some back and forth, I decided that I would have the story told from a older hero's perspective, but never really bring her into scene.
No, I
Yeah.
mean it's really beautifully handled because we have that retrospective voice, right? That comes in every once in a while, and I think some of the most some of the most beautiful biting passages especially are it's from that retrospective looking back on a younger Hira, right? And but at the same time, I don't think we ever lose sense of sort of the immediacy of the story itself, right from the get-go. You get that immense that danger of not only do we have this mysterious disease, we have the blood on the pillow, we also have a wedding coming up, we have this mysterious guy named Ali. And so there's all this set up, where you're with the story immediately, but then every once in a while, then you also get that retrospective voice as well. So I thought it was, you handled that balance, which I think can be so difficult in narration, really beautifully.
Thank you. And it's actually really funny because now when I read the passages, or even when I reread the novel to myself, or even the passages that has stood out to a lot of people, it's really interesting because most of them are the ones that were added on, which really tells you obviously
Oh,
just
that's so
how
funny.
important
Yeah.
redrafting and all that editing work is, and other people's feedback. And so I wanted to ask you if there's between either in Haji Hodak or in Logar, if there was anything sort of monumental that you changed between drafts that you now look back at and you're like, wow, thank God I did that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely, especially with 99 Nights in Logod. It's funny, I mean, I think I sort of had that similar question or tension in the narration itself, where I didn't know exactly how retrospective I wanted it to be. I remember, yeah, I think it's funny because I think we kind of had maybe like a little bit of an opposite journey, because I remember the first draft of my novel was very retrospective. Like I literally had my narrator looking at photographs from his childhood and thinking back on these times, right? And I remember I was showing these drafts to Ian Lee, who was my thesis advisor at the time at Davis, and she was the one who was really like, this voice, this retrospective voice, is actually, it's kind of getting in the way of the story at times, right? So I had sort of this, I had sort of had this reverse journey where I went back to the draft, and I was sort of trying to figure out how to get rid of the retrospective. There's places where it stays, where I think it was appropriate, but at the same time, it was this process of figuring out how to make that voice, the narration of Marwan, my main character in 99 Nights in Logod, how to make that voice as sort of as immediate as possible while still maintaining elements of that retrospective. But it was so difficult, Dore. I remember, it's I think like perspective and narration, it can be such a mysterious thing, because I remember like thinking back on that, and for me, like the retrospective was I appreciated it because I could locate my narrator in a very specific point in time looking back. And but by making it more immediate, like it became more fuzzy for me in terms of where my narrator was located in time. Is I wonder, was that a struggle at all for you and when you're figuring out the narration?
Yeah, so no, the thing that sort of really strikes me about that is because it totally makes sense that with 99 Nights in Logar, which, I mean, for people who, if you haven't read the book, please read the book. But it's set in, I think, one summer, right?
That's right.
In Logar province, when there's these like brothers who are living in the US, but they go to visit. But I think one of the reasons why it totally works is because it's clear that to the protagonist and the family, you know, that place is so deeply felt, and it's you know, very familiar. It's like the inside of your hand for them. Whereas I feel like, and that's kind of the reason why it wasn't really working too well in the case of my novel, because Hira obviously is the stranger in a completely foreign land. And if a lot of the sort of initial drafts, they had impressions that were honestly, I mean, frankly, not that interesting, because they were and there's a section in the novel where she sort of directly refers to it too, that like a lot of times newness isn't interesting. You think it will be, but it leads to a lot of naivete on the part of the observer that I sort of like, I thought that I could take out. But I wonder about that question you were asking, because I think there are a couple of times it's come up and I've always resisted, maybe for, I mean, I don't know if it's a good, maybe I should have, and when I was writing it, I think my editor was like, you know, you should know where Hira is right now or what she's doing, even if it doesn't make it to the page. And it comes up a couple of times in conversations as well. And I just really don't want to have to think about that question, because so much of the novel is about that ambiguity of like, what is home, and, you know, whether should she go, like just questions of like, what is the place for her. That sort of nailing that down feels like sort of antithetical to the spirit of the book. Yeah, but I one of the sort of, this is something that I think about a lot, and I know that from both books it's clear that you do as well. So I wanted to spend a good amount of time talking about language and how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got that on my checklist for your book as well. Yeah.
So one, I'm sure you've gotten this question so many times, but I'm so curious that I have to ask. For people who don't know, there's in 99 Nights in Logar, there's a very pivotal chapter that's written in Pashto. And it's sort of like this thing that the reader has been anticipating, or it has been building up for a good part of the novel. And then when you finally get that answer, if you will, it is in Pashto, right? And I mean, there's so much to ask about that choice, but firstly, was there resistance to it? Was like, did you have to sort of fight for that to stay?
Yeah, totally. You know, I mean, when I first came up, because I hadn't written the ending. You know, I had all these pages, and I'd showed it to my agent and my editor, and I was still trying to figure out the ending. And so when I finally got to that particular place, right, and I was like, okay, I figured it out. We're gonna do this chapter entirely in Pashto. There was like I wouldn't call it resistance, but it was certainly like hesitancy, right? And they're like, you know, what's going on here, Jamil? And so but you know, I was very fortunate in that once we, you know, my agent and I, and then my editor and I, we had this long conversation about like what I was trying to accomplish with that chapter in terms of language, in terms of, you know, the character's relationship to Pashto and to oral narratives, and to this idea of like what can and cannot be expressed through language. Then like you know, after that they were sort of on board all the way. But you know, even after the publication itself, there was, I think that was like the main complaint I got from many readers and reviewers, is like, oh, you know, we're waiting the whole time for the story, and then you wrote it in Pashto, and it was like this slap in the face. And which, you know, I totally, like, I didn't mean for it to be that way. Like, you know, that had actually, it had come out of like a concern of craft more than anything else. You know, it was a story that I knew the entire novel was leading up to, and it it was a story that's it's very autobiographical. So it's sort of this it's this tragic story from my own family's history, and it was very difficult for me to write it, and I wrote it a whole bunch of times, and it wouldn't come out. I couldn't capture that immense sense of loss that this story held for my family all these years. And so I was really stuck with that story, and it was only after like a bunch of failed drafts that I went to my father and I was like, I think actually that this is like the story that my father has to tell, because it's a story that belongs to him more than anyone else. And so once he told it in Pashto, of course, and then I went through this other process of like trying to figure out how to translate it. But it really seemed to me that like something very essential was lost in that process of translation. And then when I was thinking about the most honest way to tell that story, it seemed to me that that it sort of owed that story, that it needed to stay in sort of its original state in Pashto, in the way that it was told from my father's mouth, right? And so that book owes a lot to like this Pashtun oral storytelling tradition. I think that's what I'm trying to capture in that chapter itself.
Yeah, I that I don't know. This reminds me of I don't know if you've come across the Kashmiri poet Agha Shahid Ali. He has a line in he's written a bunch of ghazals in Arabic and or in English. And the reason why I'm making that mistake is because one of the lines from his one of his ghazals goes, "The only language of loss left in the world is Arabic." And the reason why I'm reminded of this verse is because, do you think, because I find it so interesting that there's a story of loss, right? And you thought that the only way that could be expressed was in Pashto. And I wonder how you feel about, because this is something that I constantly struggle with, where so much of the things that are closest to you exist in a language that is outside the one that you have chosen, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you either practically or spiritually sort of make peace with that or work with that? I mean, one of the great ways in which you worked with it obviously is to have that chapter in Pashto, but I mean, yeah, I'm just curious how you think about that and how you try to, work around it or work with it, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. It's actually something that I want to ask about your novel as well. But for me, I think it's a question that's central to my own relationship to my storytelling. I'm not sure if it's Rushdie or if it was Edward Said. One of them wrote something about this idea of being like exiled within language itself, right? And I think for me, like that's something that really spoke to me in terms of how I engage with my own writing, and how I'm constantly thinking through how language functions in my writing, whether that's English or Pashto or Arabic or Farsi, or even in certain instances Urdu as well. And so what I think what I try to accomplish then is that that's something that I'm constantly trying to experiment with, that I'm constantly trying to question in the writing itself, right? So for me, it's whether I'm thinking about that question of language, of my relationship to language, or to multiple languages, or my relationship to Afghanistan as a whole, or to the politics of Afghanistan. Those are always things that like I'm trying to grapple with in the work itself. And I think that's one of the things that I love about fiction writing itself so much, is that I think when I used to write essays, for example, or when I used to write when I was in grad school, it was so much about forming arguments and trying to come to solutions, and trying to come to trying to figure things out. But what I love about fiction writing is that you can just sort of leave a question. You can let a question be a question. You can let a struggle be a struggle. And so for me, all these different this lifelong struggle I've had with the English language and with Pashto, and trying to move back and forth between these spaces, it's something that I try to put on the page itself. It's something that I try to have my characters grapple with themselves, instead of offering up any easy sort of sort of answer, like in an argument or something. But I think I do want to sort of bounce that question back to you, Dore, because I think language and Hira's relationship to the English language in particular, it's this, you employ it in this really fascinating and complex way in your text as well. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. And I before that, I just want to say, I know we're getting a few questions from the audience. So we'll, Jamil, if it's okay, maybe we'll take them towards the end of the chat, unless they somehow get answered in the conversation anyway. But yeah, going back to language, so Hira comes from a background where she Urdu being sort of like this national uniting language of Pakistan, she's fully fluent in that, and that's the sort of the language that she fully considers her own. But her parents also speak Punjabi, which is a more sort of regional language within Pakistan. And then obviously because she's from South Asia and she comes from a certain amount of privilege, she's had sort of what is called English medium schooling, which means that like everything that you're taught besides Urdu is in English. And so she comes to the US with this with this strange dynamic where she is fully fluent in the language, which makes her obviously different from a lot of people who come in not having to struggle with the language. But it's more the fact that she doesn't know how to place that language as being the sort of daily bread and butter of her life, and not just something that she switches on when she goes to school, when she's reading. And I think that I think that mirrors so many people's experiences, from, especially, again, as I said, it implies that you come from a certain amount of privilege to have English in the first place. But it's I don't know, I think about it a lot because, and that's one of the reasons why I brought it up too, because sometimes I have this like moment of envy where I look at writers who are able to write fully in their, whatever you call, like their local languages, and then they're translated over into English, and that feels so much less fraught. But the thing is, of course, it isn't. I'm sure like that has its own issues, and at the end of the day, having access to English and being able to write it is also such a blessing, because I wouldn't be here talking to you maybe if that wasn't the case. But it's strange, because that means that like everything that you say feels like a translation. And I think that that's one of the things that Hira feels like she struggles with the entire during the entire time that she's in the US. But one of the things that reminded me of is in one of the stories from Haunting of Hajjot, I think it's Return to Sender, there's this interesting dynamic where there's a hinting of like, and I don't know enough about how language works within Afghanistan too, so I'm curious how there's a hinting of a hierarchy, because I think the couple that moves in are more fluent in Farsi, right? And so I wonder, like, if not that you're an Afghan representative or anything, but like how does that work, and how did you want to sort of talk about that linguistic sort of, because obviously so many, once you sort of start peeling the layers, there's the national language, and then there's the regional, and then there's dialect. Everyone thinks their language is a completely different, like you go to the north of Pakistan, everyone thinks everyone has a very different language, even if it feels very similar. And so how did you want to talk about that, or how does that exist? in your experience?
I mean, it's a really great question. The way, I mean, the way that language functions, from my perspective, in Afghanistan in particular, it's incredibly complex, right? Because I mean, so first of all, like Pashto, it belongs to the Pashtun people, who are the majority, right, and who for the longest time have been sort of the ruling class in Afghanistan, right? But at the same time, Farsi as a language is often been associated with the ruling class as well. So you would have Pashtuns in charge, but then they would largely be speaking in Farsi, and it's also a very metropolitan language as well. And then on top of that, right, you have this association between Pashto and sort of the more rural areas of Afghanistan, and then to go along with all of that, there's also research that indicates that Pashto itself, it's a dying language, right? It's being spoken less and less, which isn't the case, I believe, for Farsi. And so it becomes this very, very complicated dynamic, right? One of the things you'll see in Kabul in particular is that you'll have people who if someone speaks Pashto, they almost certainly will also speak Farsi, because it's a language with a great deal of currency in Kabul. And but that's not always the case in reverse, right? There's a lot of people who they'll speak Farsi, but they won't speak any Pashto at all. And so it's a very complicated situation. And then on top of that, you bring in English with everything else. And so, what I found fascinating about this novel is that, there are ways that English, in its association with power and with privilege, functions in the same way in Afghanistan. But then English at the same time, it's become, and it might be the similar case in Pakistan, but with the context of Afghanistan in particular, it's become such a militarized language that there's really this very direct association between the English language and translating from Pashto or Farsi into English, and the ongoing, not ongoing, but what was the 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, right? And so this method of translation became such a key feature of the occupation of Afghanistan itself, that that English, to me, it took on this like extra layer of violence, and so that's something that I think I often try to capture in the novel itself, and it's something that I grapple with as a novelist, writing in English. And so something that I'm just constantly trying to think through in my own work. But it's also why, like, I found the way English was functioning in your novel, it's so fascinating, because there are these ways that it echoed my own work, and that it echoed the context of Afghanistan, but then of course there's these peculiarities as well.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, and what's really interesting is that a lot of the times I did not really there are things that I intentionally wrote about language that are present in there, and then there are things that a lot of readers, even within the week that the book has been published, there are things that readers keep pointing to, and that they keep saying, "Oh, language is clearly a big preoccupation of yours," and I almost feel like it's great when that happens. I feel like I'm being almost told something about the novel by the readers, which is that it does have a fixation with that question, which obviously makes sense, because I feel like that's something that I think about so much. But one of the things that I did in the novel was, there are certain lines or verses that are brought in from either Urdu or Punjabi or Saraiki and different dialects. And I was going to ask you, because for that I had to actually reach out to a lot of friends, obviously not in my MFA program, people who I knew from like either the internet or my father, or just to make sure that I was didn't get things wrong. And so what are your methods for just what do you have people doing those sanity checks for you, like making sure that you don't get things wrong, especially the problem is, right, like there are things that if you got wrong, no one would know in publishing. Like
Mhm.
you could
Yeah,
very easily, like that
totally.
Pashto chapter could have been anything.
Right.
And it would have been fine. So how do you like, who do you go to, or like what are your methods for making sure that you're someone's holding you accountable?
No, yeah, I have like a resident group of like Afghan advisors that I send my work to. So I mean, first of all, it has to go through the siblings chat, and so they'll be able to catch things for me. I have a very bright siblings. One of my brothers, he's a historian, and I have that's the first layer it goes through. Then I have another chat with my PhD friends, and so they both have PhDs in anthropology, and they studied years and years of philosophy and secularism and in Islamic history and all these different things. And so they'll also give me like a check of my book, and it's like sort of like the ideological issues in the text itself. Am I, is any portion of the book Orientalist, or is it racist, or is it, what's happening here? And so and then once it goes through them, then I have my Afghan writer friends as well that I'll send the book to, and then they'll be able to and Afghan academics as well, who like have like a much more thorough understanding of the history of the country, of the social dynamics of the country. So yeah, that's really, really important to me. And so it's also why, like, it feels oftentimes it feels very oddly to me to have just my name up on the cover of the book itself, because I feel like my work, it's so much of a communal project. Like, so many different people have gone into this text, so many different voices and editors and thoughts and readers. And so I owe a lot to them, and which it actually does remind me of another question I had about your text. I read your beautiful essay about intertextuality that you wrote for LitHub. People should go check that out as well. And I was wondering if you talk a little bit about like the sort of the text you're engaging with in the book. And especially, if you don't mind, the role that Faiz Ahmad Faiz plays in the novel as well.
Yeah. I think it's a running joke now with anyone who's read my work over a period of time, including my husband, that like, how long do you go into a Dure essay without reading Fez, or like have seen him
Yeah.
mentioned. But I mean, he was the very first poet that I sort of read in any, besides just hearing poetry aloud, or um um but I mean, I guess I was going to make a joke about how the very first poet you read, if you're Muslim, is God, because
That's great. I love that. That's so
but
perfect.
besides God, it was Fez. So he's
That's great.
just he got me when I was young. Um I ended up memorizing like vast swaths of his work, which is why I think it's something about just like, the sort of the writers that you were exposed to at a very early age sort of just stick with you in a way that a lot of later writers, even if they're just as good or better, don't. And I wanted to, that was one of the things that I wanted to keep deeply autobiographical in the novel, that I wanted Hira's experience of getting sick and being sort of so for the audience, she like gets sick with tuberculosis, which isn't really a spoiler because it's revealed pretty early on in the book. And once she's in quarantine and she's alone and she has to sort of confront with a lot of these questions of like, what is the place for her, and just like this even just the feeling of being so alone all the time, she turns to Fez and finds respite in him. And I really wanted to sort of bring that into the novel.
Mm.
But one of the things that, oh sorry, and I think you also had you were going to say something about, or you asked something about intertextuality as well. The thing that I was going to bring about that was that I think one of the reasons I've been thinking about it is that I feel like there's so much, and I think Paula, you have a question about. We can actually turn to one of those questions because this sort of links to what I wanted to say. But
Yeah.
the question is, did you feel you have to make your writings have broad appeal, as Black and Brown authors historically have felt pressure to, or are you comfortable not having to have a white or American audience in mind per se? And that sort of reminded me of something that I mentioned in the essay, which is that I feel like there's a certain way in which um, writers not writing from the majority perspective are almost, I want to call it like infantilization,
Mhm.
where the it feels like even when you're looking for authentic stories, which what I don't know what that means, um the bar, it feels, is very low. It's just do you have enough foreign words in your book, or do you have enough like untranslated whatever lines,
Mhm.
whereas I feel like, and that's why I love your story so much, is they they go into so much of the, as you said, like folklore, and they go into stories, and they go into like, there are even sentences where, of course, I don't know Pashto, so I can't hear the rhythm, but I can hear something that is not English in them.
Yeah.
And that's what I think, that like those influences, and the fact that you're talking about like the story that belonged to your father and bringing that in, that all those things, all these like influences that you have matter so much more than just the fact that you put in certain words or you didn't.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I think it's something that it's funny because I found that the more precise I became with like who I was writing to, and the voice from which I was writing, the more my stories actually began to appeal to like a wider audience. It was this funny thing because I remember when I first started writing fiction, I was reading a lot of Cormac McCarthy and William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway and just pretty much your go-to sort of white guys book club list, right? And what happened is that like my narrative voice itself sounded like super white, for lack of a better word. Like I was obsessed with Cormac McCarthy especially, and so I would write these stories about young Afghans in West Sacramento or in Logad or Kabul or wherever else, but I was writing from like the neo-biblical voice of Cormac McCarthy, and it sounded super phony, it sounded super stilted, the writing was very, very bad. And so it wasn't until like I began to write with like a very specific mindset that like I'm writing these stories for my siblings or for my family members, and so when I'm thinking through the stories, it's making references to the stories and to the folklore and to the things that we grew up with, right? And so like one of the stories that was most that was the most delightful story for me to write was the tale of Dodi's Reversion, which is based upon I don't know if you grew up with this story as well. I imagine you might have, but my grandmother used to tell us that if we crossed the prayer rug when we were little, that we would turn into a monkey, and it was something that I wholeheartedly believed when I was young, and so I would avoid the fun of the Johnny Ma's like no end. I literally thought I was going to turn it into a monkey. And so I wrote this story about like this PhD student that's struggling with this faith and is struggling with all these different things and negotiating his life, and him just crossing the prayer rug while he's answering an email and then turning into a monkey. And that story was like, it was so uniquely for my family. Like when I told them I was writing the story, they were so excited about it. And but then I think it's also like it's a story that reverberates with a lot of different readers. And so that's another thing that I'm like, I think it's a great question. It's something that I'm constantly struggling with, because I remember going through that phase where when I realized that I was like, oh my God, I'm literally just writing like this, like an old white guy, and it's ruining all my stories. I started writing in a way that was very resistant to that. But that it was odd because it still felt like I was writing like directly against whiteness. It was still like I felt like I was still trapped inside of like
Yeah.
this structure around me, and I still felt like I couldn't actually tell my stories.
Yeah.
And so it was this terrible, what is catch-22, where I couldn't, I couldn't write within it. I couldn't assimilate to the voices, but when I resisted too much, it was still stilting the voice. And so that's an ongoing struggle, and it's something that I've been trying to work through and work against. But I think that's just one of the faults of writing within a white supremacist social structure in a white supremacist country. You're going to be knocking up against that throughout your life and your artistic career.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe, the thing is, like, maybe from your perspective as a writer that feels that way. I genuinely, and I think that's one of the things that's so brilliant about your work, is that at least on paper, it doesn't feel like it has anything to do with that. And of course it does, because these
That means a
stories,
lot.
they are about Afghanistan, where, that's literally, that is obviously white supremacy at work.
Yeah.
But it's still, the stories are so fully about Afghans and for Afghans that but it's interesting to know that you still feel like that's a struggle, right? Because it's impressive what you manage on paper, but I'm sure that from a craft perspective or from the writer's perspective, there's still challenges.
Can I ask you now? I want to ask you like a very selfish question, because I'm always curious to hear about how novelists deal with structure in their novels, right? And I think you handle structure in your work in it's a really brilliant, beautiful, fluid manner, right? So we start in January, and you kick off the novel by immediately giving us the disease, right? So it's like, this is the disease, as I mentioned earlier. It's the disease, it's the wedding, it's all these different things where you immediately grip the reader, right? And then but then you do this wonderful movement of you going between these chapters that start with months, where it's focused on the fever itself, right? On a literal sense. And then we're also moving between the numbered chapters, which is giving us sort of more background, and we're learning more about Hira's family and her character and her country and all these different things, right? And so I'm curious to hear, like, how did you discover that structure? Was it a struggle? And how that figured into the way that the novel is also like thinking through and playing with time.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for noticing that. When I was doing that, I was like, are people even going to realize this is happening? Because I feel like I, as a reader, just completely ignore chapter headlines or titles. So I'm very happy you picked up on that. But with the opening, actually, because initially in one of the earlier drafts, you only got to know, there was no retrospective or none of this shifting of time at all, and so you only got to know that Hera had the disease, and what disease, towards like the 75th person mark of the book.
Yeah.
And two things happened. One, I realized that it wasn't really working, because the disease, because it is tuberculosis, which is a very, you have to isolate, and it wasn't really that big plot point, because it led to just her quarantining and there being solitude and a lot of introspection. And so it didn't really work as this like suspenseful, thing.
But
And
I will say, it is gripping in the novel. I don't mean to interrupt, but it's gripping in the novel.
Oh, thank you. But the second thing that I realized is I read The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison.
Oh, beautiful, yeah.
And she, of course, far, far, far more skillfully does this thing where in the very beginning it is revealed, like the entire plot of the novel is revealed at the very beginning in that book. And so I thought that, maybe it was the best way to employ that thing that you're talking about, that gripping nature of the disease, is to actually tell the reader, from the very get-go, that, okay, this is what she's going to encounter later on, so that there's almost this feeling of a dread for the reader as he reads along, and like Hira's not eating and she's not being fed, and she's like losing weight, and so you sort of like that dread builds up.
You totally feel it. Like I swear, like as you're reading the numbered sections, you can sense like all these little hints are coming up to like, to the calamity, right? And then, once we get to the sections where she's fully struggling with the disease later in the book, like it's gripping and it is heartbreaking. And so you handle it very well, I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know that we are almost at the hour mark. But I did I still have so many questions. I'm trying to choose which one which card I want to play. Okay. Let's talk about Watak. I feel like that's, yeah, if I have to go with one. So obviously Watak is sort of this motif that is shared between both books, right? And he's obviously a big part of 99 Nights in Logar, and then he's mentioned in almost every story. And what was sort of the, like what was the thinking behind that, and what made you even like transfer him from the first book to the second one?
I mean, that was something that it occurred very, very naturally for me. The story of Watak, I think in a lot of ways, it's really the first story that I grew up with that haunted me in this really profound way. And so, Watak is my father's younger brother who, he was killed during the war, and his death happened to be like one of the primary reasons that my family actually fled from Afghanistan in the wake of this immense violence that occurred in their village, where it was being bombarded constantly. There was a series of massacres that were occurring, and so it was very much a life or death decision. And so, growing up, we always had this photograph of Watuk that hung in our prayer room. He was 16 years old when he died. This very handsome young man, and so I was always curious. And one of the things that my parents always emphasized is that, after my prayer, I would always do an extra prayer for Watuk's soul, for our martyr, our families. He was our family's main martyr. Like, in a lot of ways, I think like our most beloved ghost. And I grew up with that story for so long. But the thing about it is that it was such a difficult story for my family members to tell, especially my father and my grandmother, that I would only hear it in bits and pieces. And I think that was one of the first instances where I really felt like this deep set desire to know like the whole story. And it was something that I really had to like struggle with in my later years, because I think I really had to like examine what was at the heart of that desire. Was it rooted in just wanting to know and understand my father's suffering and my family history, or was there something a little bit more illicit in that? Was there something a little bit more devious in that desire? Something that I examine constantly in myself and in my writing as well. And so it's just, it's something that, that the book is called The Haunting of Haji Hotak. And I think, but I think, it might be more appropriate to call it something like, the haunting of Watak, or how Watak haunts my stories, or something like that, because he's sort of this figure that naturally keeps reoccurring in my work. And it's something that I've, that I've thought through, and that I've struggled with, and that I know is so deeply a part of my family's their narrative history as well, that I find myself, I keep returning to it in sort of this very organic manner. It's almost it almost occurs of its own accord.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that story with us. And with that, I think Jamil, do you want to start taking? I know we have perhaps 3 or 4 questions.
Yeah, I could start, because actually one of the questions is a question that I had for you. So I'm gonna
Great.
sort of,
Yeah.
let's sort of piggyback off this question. Yeah. So Allison wants to know.
Probably about we could take maybe about 2 more of the audience questions.
Okay. Yeah. So Allison wants to know what was more challenging for you, stories or novel. So I'm really curious. I wanted to ask you this question, Dore, because you've written these beautiful stories. They've won all these awards. They got nominated for very, very prestigious awards. So I'm very curious to hear, because I have this big struggle myself between the stories and the novels. What's it like? What is one more challenging than the other? How are you navigating between these two different forms of storytelling?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I definitely, which is funny to say because a novel is so much more work than a single story, obviously.
Yeah.
But I do find novels, I say as if I've written 10. I found it way easier to write. I mean, and I think a lot of
That's
writers
fascinating.
echo this statement, where it's just so hard to get a short story right, which obviously is like even more of a testament to how brilliant your second book is. But I think, I mean, time just works differently in them. Stories almost have to go faster, like, or I don't know, like, I think time just works in a way that makes more sense in a novel to me, because it works the way you think it's going to work, and you like are allowed to settle into things, and you're allowed to explain things in ways that in stories you just don't have, the space to. But yeah, I think a lot of the stories that I wrote, I was almost almost forced to by the MFA program that I was in, because
Oh
as
yeah,
I'm sure you do stories
I get it.
in workshops, and so but yeah, I mean, I'm curious, did you find one of them much easier or much harder?
Yeah, I love stories a lot. I remember, when I went through the process of writing 99 Nights in Logod, it was, for me, it was so harrowing, and it was so anxiety inducing, and I became so obsessive about the novel. I would think about it day and night. I would go to sleep dreaming about it. I would wake up like, oh, that maybe that will work. And I had like pages stuck up to my office wall trying to figure it out. And so I remember, and when I finally finished that final draft and I submitted it, and it was such an immense sense of relief. And at the time I was going back, it was my first semester at Iowa. And so I was back into the workshop structure after Davis. And then and I was writing stories again. And when I wrote my first story, I told myself, I was like, because one of the things about novels is like, nobody's told me what an insane task it is to just the process of revision itself, because I finished the novel and it's like 300 something pages, and I'm like, now what do I do with all these pages? Do I just start from page 1 like I do with stories and read 300 pages and just keep doing that? And so that was its own process. But when I first time I got to write a story again, I was like, I literally told myself, I was like, the story is going to be 10 pages and that's it. And I wrote this story and it was 10 pages. And then, I got down the first draft, and then I start at page 1 and I read to page 10. And then I start at page 1 and I read to page 10. And for me, that was like such like it was such a weight off my shoulders. It was such like such a smoother process than the novel writing, that like now that it's been like 3 years, and now I'm starting a new novel, like I'm dreading it so much. I keep getting distracted by these stories because I love the form so much. And so yeah, it's fascinating to hear that you thought that the novel was actually like easier to write. It sounds like you got that natural novelist bone in you.
Oh yeah, no, it is interesting too. I thought it was universal, but I guess not. Okay, let's take one more. There's a question specifically about American Fever, and I think obviously this applies to your book as well, actually. In the novel, I noticed you didn't italicize when using lines in Urdu. Also, sometimes they were not translated into English. I love that personally, but was there pushback from the publishers? And this sort of obviously touches upon some of the things that we've talked about. And actually, there wasn't. There are some publishers that have house rules about italicizing any foreign word, and that's they were actually very amenable as soon as I pushed back on that. And so I think that there really, I mean, there are a lot of, you know, positive things happening in publishing, and one of them is that there is there is growing acceptance, I think, for a lot of um, for a lot of these experiments. And so I personally did not face any of that. And of course, Jamil, you've talked about your experience with the bachelor chapter. I don't know if
Yeah.
there's
Yeah,
anything.
and what I mean with italicization in particular, like I same experience. Like I've had publishers who, because of their house rules, they go through my stories and they italicize all the words that they don't know. And so for me, you know, and I feel bad because then I'm immediately like, okay, can you just undo that? And they're always very sweet and very accommodating, and they do undo it. But I mean, for me, it's just, you know, I know it's this grammatical rule that a lot of publications follow, but for me, it's so ugly. Like I can't, you know, like it's one of these, like even more so than it is like a political or an ideological decision, but it just looks so bad to me on the page on an aesthetic level. I don't understand it. Why are we making all the words that a certain readership thinks is foreign, we're gonna just make it squiggly and that's it, and let's just make it stand out for some reason, you know? And so you know, and I think that comes back to that idea of like, who is your readership, who is your ideal audience. And so for me, you know, it's going to be like this Afghan American community, or this wider diaspora community, and for them it's not going to be, you know, it's not going to be an issue. Like one word is not going to be more foreign than the other. And I think that's, and I think it creates, and I think that's something that that you're thinking through quite brilliantly in your novel as well, as like the hierarchy of language and how that impacts power, and I think that plays into the grammar as well. And so yeah, I haven't had any issues with it. It's something that continues to perplex me.
Right.
Oh, well, thank you both. I'm so glad you brought up the discussion about language and culture in the world of publishing and how that impacts you as a writer. We had that with last week's event with Sarah and Mira. And once again, Toni Morrison was evoked in that conversation. And I know personally, I have some writer friends that are Latinx, and they have mentioned, like, they've had people say, oh, you can't mix in Hispanic words or Spanish, you know, just, you know, so I get where you're coming from. Thank you for bringing that up in this very enlightening and lively discussion. Honestly, you two, you could have had your own separate event with both of you interviewing each other separately for a whole hour. I know there's more you both wanted to ask each other, and certainly there are more audience questions. It just is a testament of how rich your writing is and your conversations about your writing and your experiences. Thank you for that. Thank you to our audience, our Book Passage audience. Thank you for supporting the event. Thank you in advance for supporting these writers and getting their books from Book Passage. You can get it in person in San Francisco or a Corte Madera store, online, or give us a call and you'll get an enthusiastic bookseller who will pop in like 20 copies of each of their books. So please do buy from Book Passage and do support these wonderful authors. Thank you so much, Duri and Jamil. I look forward to having you again in some way or fashion to the Book Passage stage, in person, online, with each other. Please keep us in mind. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.